So good afternoon, everyone. Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you be part of our 8th Campus Compact National Webinar titled Integrating Civic Outcomes Across a Major or Program, Curriculum Design, and Mapping for Civic Learning, with our wonderful and talented presenters who I will be introducing shortly. I want to remind folks that of the last webinar in our series that's coming up and encourage you to sign up if you have not done so already. The next webinar will be on April 16th, and that one is focused on the census, the upcoming Census 2020. Also, next month, our hope is to share next year's list of webinars, so you have an opportunity to sign up for those. You'll find a full list of those on our website, compact.org. I also want to plug our Compact Nation biweekly podcast hosted by the president of Campus Compact, Andrew Seligson, Emily Shields, the director of Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact, and myself. If you've heard it, you know we have a lot of fun. We just did one recently on accreditation, and there's some good ones coming up. So check out our weekly podcast, Compact Nation, on any of your favorite podcast listening apps. You won't want to miss it. So let's move on to introductions. First, I'd like to introduce our very own Ann Weiss. She has over 7 years of experience in leading collaborative assessment, evaluation, and inquiry projects focused on resolving complex problems within higher education institutions, especially as it relates to civic or community engagement. In the role of Director of Assessment with Campus Compact of Indiana, Ann develops data collection instruments, conducts literature reviews, performs data collection, analysis, and interpretation, plus advises our organization and partner campuses on how to use findings from these activities for program and organizational improvement. Additionally, Ann hosts dozens of professional learning and development initiatives across the world focused on the topic of assessing transdisciplinary learning outcomes and evaluating institution effectiveness in achieving their public mission. She's the editor of a forthcoming book from Stylus, publishing, assessing the often hidden outcomes of community engagement, and has co-authored other pieces which appear as book chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, and conference sessions. Ann is also a PhD candidate with Indiana University in Higher Education Administration, and is a visiting scholar with Tufts University's Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. And also Seth Pollack. Seth is a professor of service learning and the founding faculty director of the Service Learning Institute at California State University, Monterey Bay. Monterey Bay is one of the few higher education institutions in the country to have developed a service learning requirement for all undergraduate programs. Seth has led the efforts at Monterey Bay, Cal State Monterey Bay, to provide a framework for developing and assessing civic learning. Seth's research is focused on the integration of diversity and social justice in service learning. He has twice served as a Fulbright Scholar, awesome, researching and providing support for service learning and civic engagement programs in South Africa and Europe, and his most recent scholarship has focused on the public mission in European higher education, creating more socially responsible, diversity-minded, and civically engaged graduates. So welcome to our presenters, and at this time I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'll echo the same. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. I'm just going to quickly do an introduction to the Zoom platform. So when you move your mouse around, if you're tuning in from a PC or a Mac operating system, when you move your mouse around, you'll have a little menu that pops up from the top or the bottom of your screen, and in there you have a Q&A function. So that's where you can type in your questions, and that we will try to address towards the end of our webinar today. But if you want to test out that Q&A platform right now, you can just open that up and type in your name and your institution. We'd love to see who's here from across the country. Otherwise, though, we'll be asking some poll questions today. So again, if you're tuning in via a smart device or a computer, you should be able to participate in that poll. If you're tuning in just via telephone, you may not be able to participate in the polling options, but you do, of course, have the opportunity to download this webinar in its entirety at a different time to see what those polls were like. So again, welcome. You know the topic as it's been already introduced and ourselves, but we'll give you a little bit more information about what we're doing today. So here's our agenda. We're going to do a little bit more introductions of ourselves. Of course, we're going to look at what is curriculum mapping broadly speaking. We're going to explore what are civic learning goals, and then we're going to hear from our colleague Seth about this example of integrating mapping activities with civic learning opportunities during college. We'll move on to a call of action for you all, and then we'll close up with our discussion about any questions you have or points that we need to clarify. So again, I just want to give each one of us an opportunity to voice our own introduction of ourselves. So as you heard Marisol say, I have many roles, but what I really want to highlight today for you is, oops, sorry. I'm interrupting? No, okay. What I really just want to highlight about myself today is that actually my first attempt at a baccalaureate degree was in graphic design. I was pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts, if you will. And I've found that over the past 15 years, the principles and guiding philosophies of design still influence everything that I do to this day. So it influences when I think about curriculum design, and it influences when I think about inquiry design. I can see and I'm passionate about how we design our learning environments and our learning experiences, because as we'll talk about today, it matters. Design matters greatly to understanding our learning environments and how they contribute to students' learning and how they relate to faculty and staff's improvement of their teaching experiences. So that's just a little bit more about me, but now I'll give Seth the chance to unmute himself. That was my and introduce yourself, Seth.
Hello, everybody. Let me just say that, like Anne, this is my second career. My first career was in international development. I spent 10 years working in rural Africa, South Asia, Central America, really around community development and participatory approaches to engagement and transformation. And that got me thinking a lot about the role of outsiders in these processes, questioning a lot of the dominant paradigms, and got me asking questions about higher education. And that led to the last few decades of my work really focusing on higher education's capacity to be more of a partner to community and development processes. So that's it, and I'll turn it back over to Anne.
All right, welcome, Seth. So Marisol, this is one of our poll questions. If you don't mind pulling up the poll, we are asking you to try your best to participate in telling us, does your campus have learning outcomes at the institutional level? That's the tippity is top of your institution, your campus, your college. And are they specific to service learning and or other community-based learning experiences? And your answer options are yes, we have those, no, we do not, sort of, or I am unsure. So if you'd like to weigh in, we'll pause here and give you a moment. Okay, and so we're seeing the results of our poll, which is a sort of majority and sort of a majority at 45%. And then we're pretty much split between the yes and the no's, with some of us saying they're unsure. So that helps Seth and I just gauge who's in the room, what's our understanding of learning outcomes and the levels that they occur at. But we're going to talk about that more as we go on. So let's get right into it. I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so let's get right into what is curriculum mapping, okay? And we're going to talk about first, where does learning occur? So where does learning happen during college? Well, as you know, institutions of post-secondary education are complex places, with students learning in all corners of them, building upon the prior learning or knowledge that they bring with them. And the complexity of our educational environments poses a challenge and an opportunity to understanding where students learn and how learning is reinforced and integrated across curricular, co-curricular, and maybe even work-based or employment-based experiences. So in a most recent survey of higher education institutions, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NILOA, has seen an increased awareness of the range of places that learning happens within institutions, as well as the need to document and align learning throughout. So for example, 77% of provosts that were surveyed in this activity reported that their institutions are currently involved in curriculum mapping of some kind, but only 50% indicated that all programs of study, things like that, have learning outcomes, and that those learning outcomes are tied or aligned with the institutional level learning outcomes. And again, that was according to Jankowski, Timmer, Kinsey, and Koo from NILOA in 2018. So though, while we are growing in attention and awareness and interest of curriculum mapping, the process of mapping learning is still very much under development. All right, so who maps these curricular and these learning experiences? Well, both faculty and staff. Faculty are working to create a curriculum that intentionally builds in integrated learning opportunities over time for students to apply and practice, as well as transfer their knowledge and skills throughout assignments in campus, on campus, or outside of campus. Student affairs staff are also mapping learning that occurs in the co-curriculum and on-campus employment places or spaces, positioning the evidence for learning to support something like a comprehensive learner record, if that's the vibe or the trend at your institution. But together, faculty and staff are mapping the frequency, the location, and other related learning experiences across our diverse teaching and pedagogical moments. And overall, mapping is a key strategy for examining the role of different elements of learning environments, as well as a way to better understand where to assess and document learning across our campuses. So, this is about the levels. This is about mapping across our learning environments, whether you're faculty or staff. We are looking to expose the relationships between the various levels within our campuses. And those levels are, again, from tippity top, institutional level, department or unit level, the programs of studies within departments or units, and then the nitty-gritty everyday course-based experiences that have specific assignments, specific learning outcomes, and specific assessment activities. So mapping out these levels of learning and assessment will allow us to not only drill down to the task we ask students to undertake or to demonstrate their learning, it will also help us look across the various levels of our campuses. Again, that was institutional level, school or department unit level, program of study level, and the individual course level. And therefore, we will be able to see how the different teaching and learning elements integrate and add up to a coherent whole, a coherently whole learning experience for our students. But typically, the most common level of curriculum mapping is at that program of study level. And that's because it makes visible how courses in a curriculum, an entire curriculum, align to the learning outcomes to which that curriculum strives. In its simplest version, as you can see up here, this is a two-dimensional matrix with the courses arrayed across the top on that x-axis and the learning outcomes listed down on the left-hand side with that y-axis. As depicted here in Table 1, a mark is made in the box where a course, the columns, address a learning outcome, okay? But this may not be the only thing that we want to map. So what is another example of curriculum mapping? Here we have another example in which we look at the assessment practices or what the artifact of learning is and therefore is assessed. So here in Table 2, the assessment or expected demonstration of learning is what is actually included in the map. So we still have those learning opportunities across the top, and then the rows are the learning outcomes. But what we see in the cell is not just an X, but the artifact of learning itself, and in other words, how we're going to assess that learning. And this layer of mapping allows for examination of issues of alignment, as well as kind of like a gaps analysis, okay? The point here is that mapping can provide a visualization for how various pieces fit together and relate to learning outcomes as well as learning experiences. It allows a conversational space and lens to emerge through which to examine our educational design. It is a lens, a way of seeing, there are layers, and as they've been provided in Table 1 and Table 2, they add different dimensions to what we might change in our teaching and learning places and spaces. It will inform questions that we have about whom we might partner with, and it will inform our understanding of where and how students are learning. Again, learning inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and what artifacts we'll be getting through those learning moments. Okay. A very important part of mapping is process. But before I move on to articulate the actual processes that we might engage in, I need to make a note. This is a very important thing to consider during any mapping activity, and that is the student's experience. It is important to overlay the way students actually move through our maps. This is important because if the students are not moving through the curriculum or programming as intended, or only some groups of our students are experiencing only certain types of teaching and learning experiences, then we might begin to appreciate why we are not seeing the desired outcomes or the degree or intensity of learning that we expect or that we seek for our students. Thus, while maps can offer insight into our intended learning design, the actual student movement through our post-secondary learning environments needs to be considered when we operationalize these maps. In essence, during the process of mapping, we need to consider issues of access, equity, and participation because those are key to implementing the maps. And it is key to ensuring we design and support realistic learning pathways for all of our students. Okay, but what is the process? What are these things that we're doing to do curriculum mapping? Well, typically, a vast majority of mapping activities have been led entirely by faculty, often without any discussion with student affairs or students themselves. Thus, rarely do we see curriculum maps represent the entirety of a learning experience or the whole that our learning environments present during or across our colleges. So having said that, what are the three commonly utilized approaches for mapping? Well, one is an Excel spreadsheet or a template, which is electronically sent around to faculty and staff within a specific unit, and those individual faculty and staff complete the sheet based on the courses or the programs that they oversee or teach. And then those responses are compiled into a single file that is usually put somewhere else, usually for reporting purposes. We need to complete this map, so they send it around, and then they file it away. Another thing that we do is when a program officer or a department chair in isolation completes the entire map of the curriculum or the unit and submits it to an assessment management system or assessment office or assessment specialists at our campus. And in that case, there's usually minimal to no conversation with other faculty or staff before, during, or after that process. So one person is charged, they complete it, send it off to the person who asked for it, and again, that's usually the end of the story. But finally, we have the third most popular approach to the process of mapping, and that is when faculty and staff come together. They come together to identify which courses or programmatic learning experiences align with which outcomes and where various learning outcomes are addressed. It is a process of discussion, deliberation, conversations, and building collectively a map based on a shared understanding of what each one's role is in the learning experience of the students. Okay, and so while I don't want to imply that there is one single way to do it or that one of these are better than the other, I think you can pick up the very different ways that curriculum mapping is done, okay? But there are some things that you should consider before mapping that I want to recommend to you today. So this is our pre-flexion before engaging in mapping. I would ask you to consider and ask yourself and other colleagues if you already have existing and level appropriate, remember those levels, level appropriate learning outcomes or learning frameworks. And if you say yes, we have learning outcomes, the next question for you is if there's actually agreement to what those terms mean, okay? and or how they come about and or why they were chosen. Okay, so you might have them, but could you begin to articulate if there's a shared understanding around them? All right. The next thing you might want to ask is if there's agreement on the criteria used to decide which courses, which programs to map. This is basically an inclusion or exclusion kind of criteria. You really want to be thinking about if this course intentionally teaches to that learning outcome, or if it just happens to mention it and never actually assess it. So you want to think about which courses to include, which to exclude, and why, and be able to articulate that throughout the process. Next, you want to explore the alignment. You want to know what kind of alignment you're seeking. So are you looking for not only that learning outcomes and courses align, but that learning outcomes and syllabi, learning outcomes and activities, learning outcomes and artifacts of learning or assessment. So you need to consider what kind of alignment you're looking for. And those two tables before gave you some interest or some examples of what to consider. Okay, but really think about what kind of alignment you're seeking. And finally, you will ask questions about what the map is even able to do. What kind of useful information will this activity, this mapping activity, beget? Okay. So in essence, mapping is a strategy for visualizing the areas where we think learning is happening as it relates to specific learning outcomes that are at that level, appropriate for that level. And before we begin any mapping experience, we need to be clear on what we are trying to map and why, who should be involved in the process, if we are mapping for purposes of reporting and or improvement, and whether we are utilizing multiple lenses for capturing learning. Okay, so I'm going to quickly define the process of mapping. This is outlined through 6 questions that authors Jankowski and Marshall of 2017 recommend when defining the process of mapping. We want to ask questions about the purpose, okay? Why are we mapping? What pieces of the educational environment need to be aligned? What will be done with the map after the mapping is completed? We've kind of already hinted at that. We want to consider the scope, what parts of the learning environment are included or left out. That was a little bit of that inclusion, exclusion kind of pre-flexion activity. Participation, we've hinted at that. Who's going to participate? Why are they going to participate? How are we going to motivate their participation? That's a huge one. The form that it will take on. So how many layers of our map are we going to do? And why are we excluding some things from our map than others? Which relates to the next point, which is the limitations. We need to acknowledge the limitations of the mapping activity itself and acknowledge that the ways of which we are seeing things may automatically exclude other ways of thinking about the design of our learning environments. Finally, I want to highly encourage you to think about how you're going to disseminate and communicate that map beyond standard things like your program review, accreditation visits, and things like that. How will you communicate this work that it was useful and should be used for improvement and other purposes? All right, so let's remember that mapping is as much about the process as it is about the relationships, okay? The collaborative fashion to get others involved, both faculty, staff, maybe even students, and start to really unpack our assumptions about this. So that was our broad introduction to curriculum mapping, okay? Very quick, very broad. I appreciate that. We can field some questions later on about the process and things like that. But now I want to explore what mapping entails when we are looking at specific types of transdisciplinary learning that we can not only teach to, but we can map across our campuses and the various levels of our learning and teaching experiences, okay? And after I introduce these transdisciplinary outcomes, we'll move on to a specific example from California State University, Monterey Bay with Seth. All right, so when we're looking at outcomes of community-based or engaged pedagogies, we're typically talking about 2 broad types of categories, okay? We're talking about discipline or subject-based learning outcomes. These are those learning outcomes that a nurse needs to know to be a future nurse, that an engineer must know in order to be an engineer, that your sociology students, et cetera, okay? These are the discipline-specific theories, principles, learning outcomes that those students need. The other broad area of types of learning outcomes is what I'm labeling as transdisciplinary, okay? And there are many types of transdisciplinary outcomes. The type that we're going to talk about today is civic, civic outcomes, okay? I really quickly want to really hone in on what I mean by transdisciplinary. So they're transdisciplinary and they're civic because of two things. Number one, they are those things that represent outcomes, learning outcomes, developmental outcomes beyond any single one discipline or program of study, okay? They rise above and spill out over the container of that discipline and are the knowledge, skills, attitudes, or abilities that any human needs in order to engage in our society, okay? And what makes them civic in nature is because those learning outcomes are, as Dewey stated back at the turn of the 20th century, they are those knowledge, skills, and abilities that any human needs to possess in order to contribute to the creation of a freer and more humane experience in which we all share and to which we all contribute. And that's what I mean by transdisciplinary. Okay, it rises over and spills over the container that is a discipline, and it's civic in nature because it allows us to engage in our society, specifically our democracy, and working across difference with others. Okay, so that's where we're going to focus today, is those transdisciplinary learning outcomes that are civic in nature. And I'm going to quickly introduce you to 5 big, broad civic learning goals. Okay, these are huge civic learning goals. They're not necessarily measurable civic learning outcomes. That's a whole nother presentation. But real quickly, what are they? One is civic knowledge. Okay, this is usually the most cognitive of our civic learning goals. In fact, right now, you could pull up your favorite internet browser, such as Google, and you could Google civic literacy quiz, and you'll find some really good examples of questions we can ask that have right and wrong answers that relate to assessing or measuring a student's civic literacy or their civic knowledge, okay? And these are things like questions we ask on the U.S. naturalization exam, which happens to be an oral exam, but it's do you know the 3 branches of government? Do you know who the founding fathers are? Let alone contemporary things around civic knowledge. Okay. Next one is a civic identity. The thing I really want to hone in about a civic identity is it's moving from the me to the we. Okay, it's moving from the I know this, I know that, I can do this, into the we know this, we know how to address this, we can do this together. Okay, and so that's a civic identity, is when you're moving to the we. Next is civic agency. So not necessarily regardless of if you have a fully fledged civic identity, but we're looking at the behavioral aspects now. We're looking at how we act together to address some of the most wicked problems facing our communities. Okay, so that's that agency, that efficacy, that I can take action. I have the knowledge, the confidence, the efficacy to take action. It's behavioral in that way. Next, we have instilling or helping students verbalize or actualize the values in a democratic society and the norms in a democratic society, okay? So valuing or articulating a value for things like equity and justice, engaging in norms of our democracy like voting, civil disobedience, and things like that, okay? So those are 4 big popular civic learning goals. The penultimate one is the civic-minded graduate. It's arguably the goal of higher education, right, to some degree, that we want to beget these civic-minded graduates. The point I need to make is that, as I've already said, these are big and broad and not necessarily measurable. They have many dimensions, many characteristics, and therefore a lot of potential to map how we achieve these big, broad goals across the levels of our learning environments, okay? So one course could decide, I can definitely hone in 16 weeks something about empathy, okay? But maybe my program of study really wants to work on that whole domain of working with others. And so my program of study would map out what courses have learning outcomes related to perspective taking, valuing of collaboration, openness, and curiosity or questioning. And then we would be able to map to how our program of study relates to working with others. And maybe across our entire school someday, we will want to map out all those other domains and how therefore students who come out of the College of Arts and Letters or Arts and Sciences come out as civic-minded graduates, okay? So there's a lot of potential here. And I'm really excited to see an example from CSU Monterey Bay. But before we do that, this is our second poll. So Marisol, if you will, we are asking you to think about those civic learning goals that we just articulated and try to see where you may appreciate that they exist. And if possible, this is a check all that apply. But if you have to choose one, just know which one's the highest level that you know you have civic learning goals or civic learning outcomes articulated. So keep those answers coming in. We're going to present the results in just another minute. Okay. Unsure or unaware, I'm not too surprised. Okay, next most popular is at the institutional level. Okay, I think once we can appreciate the transdisciplinary nature of some of our institutional level goals, many of us probably already do have something that's civic-ish in nature. All right, so let's just use this new knowledge that we have and look at our institutions and eventually see if there's different levels that hit at these civic learning goals or civic learning outcomes. Thank you for sharing that poll. So now we get to move on. I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint to our example from our colleague Seth at California State University at Monterey Bay. So Seth, I will try my best to drive these slides and you can go ahead and start.
Okay, I'm not driving here, no hands on my wheels. So, Anne, you're up. Let me introduce you first to Cal State University, Monterey Bay. We're a public university, part of the largest bureaucracy of higher education in the world. 500,000 students, 23 campuses, and one rule system, one chancellor. And though we are a distinctive university of 8,500 students, we're part of this larger system, which has impacted how we do our civic learning work. And I'll talk about more about that later in the presentation. So CSUMB was founded in 1995 with a distinctive mandate as a new university to be relevant to and engaged with our region. And as a university created from scratch only 25 years ago, we were informed by some of the best practices and some of the best intentions of the time. Outcomes-based education, interdisciplinarity, active engaged learning, and the commitment to developing students' social responsibility across our curriculum. We are also informed by our context. We're a large agriculture and tourism-oriented service economy. Our county, Monterey, produces over $5 billion, with a B, $billion in fresh produce, strawberries, lettuce, artichokes. And as a result of that hand picking and hand weeding, we have huge issues of inequality in our region. Not much different from those captured by Steinbeck, who was writing 50 years ago, 60 years ago about this very same county, and in which his books were banned at the time. That inequality is captured nicely in this article from the New York Times in 2016. In a California valley, Salinas Valley, healthy food everywhere but on the table. That describes our reality. $5 billion in fresh produce, and the people who work the fields can't afford to buy it. Over 100,000 people, 20% of our county, get food from the food bank each month. So we have significant issues of poverty, especially within the underserved, undereducated, largely Latinx farm worker community, the very population that our university was created to serve. Now, while many of these innovations circa 1995 have not withstood the test of time, for example, we had a major called International Entrepreneurship and Management, IEM, which is now called business. And we had Earth System Science and Policy, which has been broken up into geology and biology. So the disciplines have overcome our desire for interdisciplinarity. We are, and again, we're part of the largest bureaucracy in higher education. Somehow, civic learning has stayed core to what we do. A big part of that is our service learning requirement. Now, having a service learning requirement is unusual in higher education, but what's more unusual are these three features of service learning at CSUMB. Here at CSUMB, service learning is an academic department. The Service Learning Institute is an academic department. Service learning has a knowledge base and is not, let me repeat, is not just a pedagogy. So I would sort of quibble a bit with how we framed the initial poll, which said, are there specific learning outcomes for service learning and or other community engaged pedagogies? Here, service learning is not just a pedagogy, it has concrete learning outcomes. So that means learning about service, about being of service, and about being of service in a diverse, inequitable society is at the core of the knowledge base at this university. Secondly, learning about service is required for all students, just like reading, writing, and arithmetic, and we call that critical civic literacy. And it's integrated into both our general education program and the requirements of each major. And what that means is that not only does every major need to offer service learning courses, but those courses need to teach to these specific service learning outcomes, grounded in these four concepts: self and social awareness, service and social responsibility, community and social justice, and multicultural community building or civic engagement. Just a short side note here, I say old learning outcomes because, as I mentioned, we're part of the largest educational bureaucracy in the world. Have I said that before? And last August 2017, our chancellor released executive order 11 campus to reduce their general education from 60 to 48 units, a 20% cut, and to systematize the delivery of that GE to conform it across the 23 campuses to make it easier for students to transfer from campus to campus. That had a significant impact on our distinctive general education embedded service learning program, which is somewhat ironic as we thought embedding service learning in general education was a great institutional strategy, which it is until general education itself becomes under attack. Anyway, the fact that civic learning was embedded in the core knowledge base of GE, next slide, Anne, and in our majors was probably the primary reason why CSUMB was cited in the 2012 document, A Crucible Moment, College Learning and Democracy's Future, as incorporating civic responsibilities with career preparation. We would say we don't want students to be just technically competent in their field. We also want them to be socially responsible, or, as we say, we want students to be multicultural community builders. Students who have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to work effectively in a diverse society to create more just and equitable workplaces, communities, and social institutions. So really, this is our attempt to articulate our vision for what Anne referred to as civic-minded graduates. This is our big overall goal, more explicitly grounded in our values around justice and diversity. And every degree program is held accountable to that. Now, our assessment work is led by our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. And if you go to that website, you'll see this model prominently presented. This holistic alignment emphasizes how professional development relates to the identification of best practices in our teaching and learning, and how both of those areas are informing and being informed by our assessing of curricular learning outcomes. And you can see on the one hand, we have assessment work that is linked to our academic program and our academic program review and learning outcomes assessment. And on the other hand, we have that same assessment project linked to undergraduate learning outcomes, ULOs, general education learning outcomes, GELOs, and at the graduate level, graduate learning outcomes. But at the core of this work is this phrase, and this, I referred to Dan Shapiro, our director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Assessment, to try to get a citation accurate for this. He said, just say we invented it. So we invented this. the phrase that learning outcomes are only as good as the conversations they generate. And I want to underscore that there's a real tension in the trenches of the assessment field, especially from a faculty perspective. Are we doing assessment for accountability purposes, for compliance, to demonstrate to some outside authority, our state legislature who cuts our checks, or to our parents or students who pay the bills? Are we doing this to show them that learning is happening? Or are we doing this for our own growth and development as educators, for our continuous renewal, for our increased capacity and effectiveness? For us in our system, and perhaps this is how we get faculty participation, this is really about continuous renewal as educators, a process to guide our own reflection on the effectiveness of our work as instructors. So the university has invested in building out this assessment infrastructure. We have college assessment fellows who guide the assessment and academic program assessment in their academic departments and degree programs. We have assessment scholars who lead learning communities for each of the undergraduate learning outcomes. And we're all following the same assessment process to facilitate this conversation, to get a better sense of how students and we are doing in learning. So we start with learning outcomes, which we then map. We develop rubrics and rubric guides to better explain what that rubric language is. We identify either signature assignments, a specific assignment to be integrated into a variety of courses, or we create assignment guides to help instructors develop diverse, robust assignments of their own. We identified threshold concepts, which really describe the essential, challenging, and transformative core ideas central to each of these learning outcomes. And finally, we collect and review samples of student work. And of course, this is an iterative process, as the insights from looking at student work help us to revisit and revise our learning outcomes, our rubrics, and our assignments. The bottom line is that assessment is all about faculty interactions around the learning outcomes and using assessment and mapping to 1, talk about, 2, more deeply understand, and 3, revise and change those learning outcomes, always based on our insights derived from our assignments and looking at samples of student works. And remember, learning outcomes are only as good as the conversations they generate. So let's take a look at how this process of assessment is superimposed on our campus's commitment to service learning and civic learning. And if we do that, here's what emerged. We have these 3 levels of civic learning outcomes, which means 3 levels of assessment conversations, all of which build up to our version of the civic-minded graduate, the multicultural community builder. A lower division general education conversation based on our new civics service learning requirement. We have an upper division conversation, which is really based in the majors, in the departments as part of their work to see how socially responsible their students are and where they're learning that. And the Service Learning Institute has a big role in supporting that. And we have a campus-wide conversation at the level of our undergraduate learning outcome number 2, which is called personal, professional, and social responsibility. And of course, these are meant to be developmental, scaffolded learning experiences. And if you could get the little out, if you could click, you can see that the learning outcomes listed at each level are really connected. You can see the internal consistency which emerged, even though these 3 things have different time frames in their evolution, and some nice resonance with the concepts that Anne presented earlier. So let's just look briefly at the learning outcomes associated with each of these 3 levels. First contact that students have is at the lower division general education requirement on civics service learning. This previously was 2 separate learning outcomes, a service learning requirement called community participation and a civics requirement called democratic participation. Those have now been merged, and you see we have 3 areas of outcomes: civic identities, civic knowledge, and civic action. And in the action part, we're really looking at not just ethical service, but we're looking at civic advocacy or civic action projects. At the next level, the second level is embedded in the content of each major. And while we have similar categories, the distinctive focus here is on the development of a professional sense of civic identity and capacity for action. The self and social awareness outcome looks at one's professional identity and its relationship to the civic space. The service and social responsibility outcomes, again, looking through the lens of the field or the profession and how it's either perpetuating inequities or contributing to greater equity and social justice. And finally, the action dimension is framed not just around the personal, but also professional strategies and practices, which also emphasize systemic change. Finally, at the campus level, we have our undergraduate learning outcome number 2, personal, professional, and social responsibility. This language has been worked on over the past 3 years, and finally we have something that we're happy with as a campus. CSUMB graduates engaged in ethical reasoning and public action informed by these 5 dimensions: historical, multicultural, global, ecological, and an equity-orientated perspective. I'm currently the chair of this learning community, and we have faculty from across campus, from business, kinesiology, liberal studies, Spanish, psychology, and service learning, all developing the rubric and the assignment guides that will help flesh this out. As we do this, the question that's emerged that's going to guide our understanding and our looking at what is happening for our students, as we look at student work, we want to ask the question, is this evidence of student action ethically informed public action? So what does that look like? These are the components of the rubric as they've evolved. First, you see we have the 5 dimensions of ethical reasoning that we talked about earlier. Then that ethical reasoning informs one's personal or professional public identity, which has both a breadth component, the extent to which those 5 dimensions are present, and a depth component, the clarity of the commitment and the integration of the personal and the professional. And finally, that personal and professional public identity is then enacted in terms of a public action. And that public action has 2 components. First, its coherence with one's ethical framework. And secondly, its scope. Whether the impact is at an interpersonal context or a wider systemic societal conflict. And again, all these outcomes are dealing with issues of identity, privilege, and oppression, and systems of inequality. And again, these are building on each other, either ethical reasoning informing a sense of personal and professional public identity, which then informs public action. So as I mentioned, we're currently completing this rubric, and we'll be reviewing student work in May. And then next year, we'll be moving on to increase work around assignment guide development and our threshold concepts. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Anne, and perhaps there are questions about what's been accomplished.
Thank you. I look forward to that, and I just have some closing comments. Echoing. Is that better? Okay, so I just have some closing comments before we move on, and that is your opportunity in front of you. Let me switch that. Okay. So in essence, I hope you hear that you have an awesome opportunity in front of you to consider where we are teaching to maybe these transdisciplinary civic and nature learning outcomes, let alone across your program of study for a particular discipline or interdisciplinary experience. And so you can map where they're occurring and of course how they're occurring as well. And in essence, helping us, our field, appreciate how we are allowing these learning environments to be intentionally designed for our biggest, broadest student population always remembering to consider creating the map is one thing. Let's not forget to overlay the students' actual pathways through these learning experiences so that we always consider issues around equity, access, and learning pathways. Okay, so that's the learning or the opportunity in front of you. We have one closing poll, and I think we have enough time to do it, and then we'll entertain questions from the Q&A. So this is your chance to respond to our interest in something you may have gauged during your time today with us. You may need more time to sleep on it and make up your mind, but we're wondering how important you think it is to map civic learning across our courses, our programs, and or our campus. So writ large, how important is curriculum mapping? A couple more seconds to weigh in. Okay, drum roll please. I'm guessing if you showed up today to this webinar, you are highly motivated. So A, thank you again for showing up. And I appreciate this immediate feedback about your own opinions regarding how important it is that we do curriculum mapping across our collegial learning environments. So again, thank you for being here. I now welcome Marisol to chime in maybe, or should we look at the Q&A ourselves and decide what questions we can address?
Sure, why don't you do the Q&A now?
Okay, I'm gonna open the Q&A. Thank you to those who were checking in. I really appreciate that. So we have a question for Seth, and it is, when you say only as good as the conversations they generate, so that fabulous statement about learning outcomes, do you mean conversations among faculty or staff, or the conversations students have as a result of the learning experience? Do you want to extrapolate on that for us? Don't forget to unmute yourself before.
And I think I'm holding on your screen and I'm not.
Oh, okay.
Am I now unmuted?
Yes, you're good.
Great. So no, we're definitely referring to the conversations by faculty and by staff in our own work to understand how are we doing as educators, right? It's one way to undo this black box of the classroom, right? Previously, teachers would go in the classroom, you'd shut the door, and whatever came out, came out. And the accountability movement in education, both in K-12 and higher education, is really meant to break down that box. Other people want to see what's happening. But we also want to be able to benefit from our work in assessment. And we want to see it as that being the primary driver, that we want assessment to drive our conversations amongst faculty as we try to achieve these really challenging learning outcomes. You've seen what it means to teach to the civic-minded graduate or the multicultural community builder. That's challenging work, especially for someone in chemistry, if not only in sociology or in business or in computer science. This is really important work, and it's important that we talk to each other. And of course, we want students to not just be taking notes. We want them to be talking and learning.
Thank you for that. I would love to see the day where students want to engage in a conversation about learning outcomes and what they're doing. I do believe that engaging students in a mapping activity would lead to some of that. I would err on the side of really knowing your student population and who to best engage in those moments. Of course, if you're doing a program of study, you might want to consider alumni who haven't been too far gone from their undergraduate or graduate experience. But certainly looking at learning outcomes can beget very good conversations amongst different populations. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Feel free to type them into the Q&A area.
I have a question for you guys.
Oh, yes, good.
So how does this look with like e-portfolios and aligning them to assignments with e-portfolios. Can you speak to that?
Am I unmuted? Yes. I wish we had e-portfolios. That would be such a fantastic tool. And I've been in conversations with other universities that are using that. And what's nice about that is it, in a sense, allows the conversation to happen with students too, right? Because they're choosing from amongst their work, amongst their artifacts of their own learning, what they think best represents these various, let's just call them baskets of knowledge, right, that we've created called learning outcomes. And that creates a whole opportunity for reflection and engagement around the extent to which that's really inaccurate, that's a representation, or if that's an awesome example of the learning in that area. So no, I'm really a big fan of e-portfolios and seeing some great examples of how that's being used across campuses.
I would just add that I understand that e-portfolios can be used as an artifact of evidence from one particular learning experience, but it's more popular to utilize them as a capstone kind of artifact. And I think that's typically what we think about with e-portfolios. So they are definitely a source of information for two good areas, and that is if it's utilized as a capstone artifact, as Seth indicated, you'll be able to see what students are articulating is the most pertinent, most demonstrates the strongest learning that they've had happen throughout their entire experience in a program of study or at your higher education institution. And therefore, because the students are choosing it, we can also look at it as program coordinators or curriculum design experts to say, maybe this is another source of information for how students move through our learning experiences. Because of course we can overlay who actually enrolled in courses and at what time and looking at those things, but if we look at student-generated artifacts, it's just one more way to understand how students appreciate that their learning was scaffolded, that it was intentionally connected, let alone when there's a particular pedagogy, if that's the way your institution approaches these things, how that relates to their learning when they choose to highlight that it was when I connected service to my course content, when I connected my internship to my course or major content. So they're definitely good sources of information overall. And then finally, as for civic learning outcomes, there's a ton of potential. And that really just lies in the way that we prompt students through e-portfolios to choose the best artifacts of their civic learning. So I'm really excited for the potential that I already have seen institutions use e-portfolios for articulating students' civic learning through a course or an entire program of study or learning pathway at a particular institution. Thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. So, go ahead, Seth.
I just want to take 10 seconds to say we need to break down the wall between transdisciplinary and discipline-specific learning. This stuff, civic learning is never going to be taken seriously until our disciplines own this as legitimate content. That was just a personal plug. Thank you.
And I think CSU has done a great way, and I believe that Seth's short amount of time is a great way to illustrate how to break down even the wall between transdisciplinary and discipline is when we engage and we think about our professional lives, our professional selves as transdisciplinary in nature. So I'm totally going to back you up in that completely. Okay, I'll take over.
No, that's great. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for sharing your knowledge and experience on this topic as part of the webinar. Definitely something that this field is interested in exploring more. It was truly engaging and meaningful. And I want to thank the attendees for your participation and engagement. We have had overwhelming success with this national webinar series over the course of the year with over 2,000 registrations between and amongst the 9 webinars that we have offered and will offer this year. So I want to encourage you to all fill out the evaluation survey that will be in your inbox shortly and provide us with feedback. We'll be looking at those as we begin the planning of next year's national webinar series. And until next time, thank you all. Bye.
Bye, thanks for coming. Thank you, Seth.
Everybody.